Imagine you're walking your little girl to school, just another normal day, when the sky catches fire. That's what happened to Maria Santos. One second she was holding her daughter's hand, and the next, the clouds were raining down molten orange death. She didn't even think. She just scooped up her daughter and ran. But where do you run when the whole world is exploding? Screams echoed everywhere as buildings crumbled into dust. The air got so hot it felt like breathing in a furnace, thick with smoke and grit. Maria managed to find a basement already packed with 30 other terrified people. Huddled in the pitch black, they could only listen as their city was torn apart above them. Her daughter, Sophia, only 7 years old, kept tugging on her sleeve, asking, "Mommy, what's happening?" Maria had no answer. For 6 straight hours, the world shook. And when it finally stopped, the alien ships descended. Thousands of Vethkai soldiers marched into the ruins, but they weren't here to conquer. They were here to harvest. The Vethkai sorted through the survivors with a horrifying efficiency. The old and the sick were just shot on sight, useless to them. But the young and the healthy were shackled and forced onto massive transport ships, destined for a short, brutal life of slave labor. In the middle of all that chaos, they ripped Sophia right out of Maria's arms. Maria fought back, screaming and clawing, but a soldier slammed his rifle into her head, and her world went dark. She woke up in the freezing hold of a ship, crammed body to body with hundreds of others. Her daughter was gone. A cold, heavy certainty washed over her. She would never see Sophia again. The raid on the colony of New Cascadia was over in 3 days. When the Vethkai left, they'd taken 4 million human beings with them, and they left behind 14 million dead. Haven City was now a ghost town of ash and twisted steel. Green forests were now just charred skeletal remains, and the rivers were choked with a toxic ooze. A vibrant world had been turned into one giant graveyard. The first rescue ships from Earth didn't show up for another 2 weeks. They found the few survivors hiding in caves and subway tunnels. They found mass graves that stretched for miles, and they found data recorders that had captured it all. The sounds of pure terror, the roar of the flames, and the chilling final moments as families were torn apart by the Vethkai's absolute cruelty. Captain James Chen was one of the first rescuers on the ground. As he walked through the skeleton of the city, tears carved clean lines through the filth on his face. His brother, his sister-in-law, and their 3 kids had lived here. He spent days digging through the rubble, clinging to a tiny, impossible thread of hope, but the only place he found their names was on the ever-growing list of the dead. Standing in the ashes of his brother's home, he made a silent vow. He didn't have to speak the words. Rage and grief had already burned the promise into his very soul. Someone was going to pay for this. Someone was going to answer for 18 million lives. The news from New Cascadia hit the rest of humanity like a tidal wave. On Earth, people wept openly in the streets. Across the colony worlds, families frantically scanned the networks for any news of their loved ones. This wasn't like the wars they'd had before. Human against human. This was different. This was an attack from something alien, something that had zero mercy, something that looked at humanity and saw nothing more than cattle to be either slaughtered or branded. The government of the United Earth Federation sent out an urgent plea to the Galactic conquered. The Concord was the great council of the galaxy, where 12 ancient and powerful races made the rules for everyone else. They were supposed to be the peacekeepers, the defenders of the weak. Surely they would do something. Ambassador Elena Vasquez was chosen to be humanity's voice. At 52, she was a career diplomat who had dedicated her life to building bridges between species. She was a woman who truly believed in peace and cooperation. She honestly believed that for all its flaws, the galaxy was a place where justice could still be found. She traveled to the Concord's Great Station, a colossal structure floating in neutral space, so ancient it predated human existence. It was built by races who were old when humanity was still figuring out fire. This was where the 12 elder races decided the fate of entire civilizations. Elena walked into the grand chamber with her head held high. The room was immense, with tiers of seats rising in a circle around a central platform. The delegates of the 12 races looked down at her. Some had scales, some had fur. Others looked like they were made of living crystal or polished stone, or things she just couldn't comprehend. But they all had one thing in common. They were ancient, powerful, and they all stared down at her like she was a toddler who had wandered into a boardroom meeting. "The representative of humanity may now speak," the Concord's chairman announced. He was an ancient being of living rock known as the Primarch, and he had led this council for 3,000 years. Elena stepped forward. Her voice was firm, but inside she was trembling with grief and rage. 18 million of my people are dead," she began. 4 million more have been taken as slaves. Our colony on New Cascadia has been annihilated. This attack was completely unprovoked. We had no conflict with the Vethkai Dominion. We had no quarrel with them at all. They came to our world and butchered our children for one simple reason: because they could. Because they wanted free labor, and because they were confident no one would dare to stop them. She paused, scanning the faces in the chamber, but their expressions were impossible to read. "We come before this council today asking for justice," she continued. "We demand the return of our stolen people. We demand that those responsible be held accountable. And we demand a guarantee that this will never, ever be allowed to happen again. We are asking for what any species would ask for when their innocent people have been murdered and enslaved." When she finished, a heavy silence filled the chamber. Then the VTHKAI representative rose to speak. His name was Kethvor, and he was the cousin of the commander who had led the attack. He looked at Elena with cold, black eyes, his voice dripping with contempt. "The human delegate speaks of murder and slavery as if they are some great cosmic sins," he sneered. "They are not. The galaxy is a dangerous place. The strong have always taken from the weak. That is the way it has always been, and the way it will always be. Humanity is a young, naive species. You still don't understand your place in the universe. Perhaps this painful little lesson will finally teach you." Elena's hands balled into fists at her sides. She fought to keep her voice steady. "You call the slaughter of children a lesson?" she shot back. "I call it reality," Kethvor replied smoothly. "The Vethkai Dominion required laborers. Your colony had them. So we took them. This is simply the way the galaxy operates. If humanity finds this disagreeable, then perhaps humanity should find a way to become stronger." A low murmur of chatter immediately filled the chamber. Elena watched in horror as the ancient races conferred. She caught fragments of their conversations, words like unfortunate, regrettable, and a complicated issue. She heard them mention their trade agreements with the Vithkai. She heard them talk about everything except justice. After 3 hours, the Primarch raised his stone hand for silence. "The Conquered has reached a decision," he declared. "We find that the Vithkai Dominion's actions have caused significant distress to humanity. For this, the Vithkai will pay a financial restitution to the United Earth Federation. A committee will determine the amount. Furthermore, the Vithkai representative will issue a formal apology. This matter is now concluded." Elena just stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. "Financial restitution?" she repeated, her voice cracking. 18 million of my people are gone, and you're offering us money?" "The Conquered's judgment is final," the Primarch said, his voice flat. "What about the slaves?" Elena demanded, her voice rising. "What about the 4 million human beings being worked to death in Vithkai camps as we speak?" The Primarch was silent for a long, terrible moment. He actually said, "The internal policies of conquered member states are none of our concern. The Vithkai are free to manage their labor force as they see fit." "Labor force?" Elena's voice cracked with disbelief. "You're calling people in chains a labor force?" "The specific words you use are irrelevant to the Conquered." Elena scanned the colossal chamber, her eyes falling on beings made of pure crystal, living stone, and shimmering scales, all of them ancient, all of them so used to power they'd forgotten what it was to be small and scared and broken. "So this is what you call justice," she said, her voice a whisper laced with icy rage. "You offer us blood money and hollow apologies after our children have been slaughtered. Our families are enslaved, and you call it an internal affair. Is this the great protection the Conquered offers?" The Primarch's stone face gave nothing away. "Humanity is not a member of the Conquered," he stated, his voice as cold as deep space. "You are here merely as observers. You have no rights in this chamber beyond what we choose to grant you." "Then what does it take to become a member?" Elena asked, playing her last desperate card. "Membership requires a unanimous vote from all 12 elder races," the Primarch droned on. "It also demands proof of at least 10,000 years of interstellar civilization. Humanity has been spacefaring for 2 centuries. You may apply for consideration in approximately 9,800 years." In that single, crushing moment, something inside Elena didn't just break. It shattered. It wasn't her heart. Her heart had been turned to dust the moment she watched the footage from New Cascadia. What died in that chamber was her faith that the galaxy was good, that cooperation worked, and that if you cried out for help, someone, somewhere, would actually answer. And in that instant, she finally understood. They were utterly, terrifyingly alone. The great powers of the galaxy didn't care about burning human homes or families torn apart by slavers. They cared about their shipping lanes, their spheres of influence, and keeping their comfortable lives from being disturbed. As she turned to walk away, the weight of total defeat pressing down on her, the Vethkai ambassador Kethfor spoke up one last time. "Ambassador Vasquez," he called out, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "You should really take the deal. Be grateful we're offering you anything. Humanity is a gnat in a galaxy of giants. You can't fight us. You can't defy the Conquered. You are powerless here. So take the credits, cry over your dead, and get on with your lives. That's the best advice you're going to get." Elena stopped and slowly turned, locking her eyes onto his. She stared into those cold, arrogant black pits and didn't say a single word. But her silence was a promise that screamed across the stars. He really believed it. The absolute fool honestly thought humanity would just tuck its tail and accept this humiliation. He had no clue what kind of sleeping giant he had just kicked in the ribs. "You say we're powerless." Elena's voice cut through the chamber's hush like a shard of glass. "And maybe today, you're right. Today, we're weak. We're young. We're a tiny flicker of light in a galaxy that wouldn't shed a tear if we went out tomorrow. But I want every last one of you to burn this moment into your memory." She swept her gaze across the room, meeting the eyes of every single delegate. "We are human," she said, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous growl. "We're the species that survived ice ages. We lived through planet-killing plagues. We fought wars that set our own world on fire and came back from the ashes. We are the ones who climbed out of caves and built ships that could touch other stars. We are the species that literally does not understand the meaning of the word quit. You think we're going to forget what you allowed to happen on New Cascadia? Never. You think we'll forgive this? We won't. You think this wound will just fade with time? It will not." She strode toward the massive exit doors, then paused and looked back one last time, her expression haunting. "You will all remember this day," she promised them. "You'll remember that you were given a choice. You could have chosen justice. You could have reached out to us when we were at our lowest point. You could have proven that morality isn't just a word in this galaxy, but you didn't. You chose to look away. You chose profit over principle. You chose the easy path over the right one. That was your choice. And from this day forward, you get to live with the consequences." She walked out of the chamber, and as the doors sealed behind her, the sound of condescending laughter followed her down the hall. A few of the representatives found her little speech absolutely hysterical. A baby species puffing out its chest and making empty threats. It was ridiculous. It was adorable. But not all of them were laughing. Some of the older delegates, the ones who had seen empires rise and crumble like sandcastles, watched her go in a deep, unsettling silence. They had been around for a very long time. They had seen it all. And a few of them, though they'd never say it out loud, felt a strange, cold prickle of unease. There was something in that human's eyes, a fire in her voice that reminded them of ancient myths, tales of young, overlooked races that were pushed one step too far, species that were so consumed by grief and rage that they were reforged into something else, something terrifying. But that was impossible. Humans were too weak, too new, too insignificant to pose a threat, right? Naturally, Elena flew straight back to Earth and reported to the Federation Council. She laid it all out, the Concord's cold shoulder, the Vithkai's open mockery, the disgusting offer of cash for 18 million dead men, women, and children. When she was done, the silence in the room was absolute. "So what's your official recommendation, Ambassador?" President Martinez finally asked, his voice thick with sorrow. Elena paused for a long, heavy moment, letting the weight of her next word settle. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded like cracking ice. "I recommend we accept none of it," she said. I recommend we remember all of it, and I recommend we begin preparing for the day we can finally speak to the galaxy in the only language it seems to respect." "And what language is that?" the president asked. Elena looked him straight in the eye, her own gaze filled with a terrible new wisdom, paid for with an ocean of blood and tears. "Power," she said. "We will speak to them with so much power they won't have a choice but to listen." The council voted that same night. The decision was unanimous. Humanity would refuse the money, humanity would not forgive the Vthkai, and humanity would never, ever forget. And so, the great silence began. The rest of the galaxy just moved on, forgetting the loud, emotional little human species almost overnight. It wasn't hard. Humans were a rounding error in the grand cosmic equation. They had 17 colonial worlds and a fleet of maybe a few hundred ships. The Vthkai Empire alone ruled 3,000 worlds and commanded 50,000 warships. The ancient elder races of the Concord controlled millions of star systems. In the vastness of space, humanity was less than a single drop in the ocean. After Ambassador Vasquez's little tirade, there was some minor gossip about what the humans might try to do. Some of the more arrogant species expected a stupid, suicidal attack. Others guessed they'd just crumble into civil war, destroyed by their own grief. A few even figured humanity would just wither away, too broken by the loss of New Cascadia to go on. None of it happened. Instead, humanity did something that nobody in the entire galaxy could have predicted. They just went quiet. Human diplomats still showed up at galactic meetings, but they rarely said a word. Human freighters still ran the trade routes, but their crews kept to themselves, avoiding eye contact in spaceport bars. Human colonies continued to function, but they stopped granting tourist visas to alien visitors. It was as if the entire human race had collectively drawn a massive curtain around its part of space and simply disappeared from the galactic stage. At first, the elder races found it funny. "Looks like they're having a little pout," the Vthkai representative chuckled in the assembly hall. They sneered, acting like spoiled kids who didn't get their favorite toy. "They'll come crawling back to us eventually," they said, begging for scraps from our table. But the years started to slip by. A decade passed, then two, and humanity never came crawling back. They didn't ask for a single thing. They didn't even bother to complain anymore. They just existed. Quietly, without making a fuss, doing nothing that seemed even remotely important or threatening. So the rest of the galaxy just moved on, getting caught up in its own endless dramas. There were trade wars to wage, new systems to claim, and old scores to settle. Humanity was just a forgotten footnote in the history books, and that was precisely what humanity had been counting on. Because behind that wall of silence, something absolutely mind-blowing was taking place. The entire human race was rebuilding itself from the DNA up, and they were doing it in complete and total secrecy. It all kicked off with President Martinez's speech to the people, just 3 months after the conquered handed down their insulting verdict. His voice was beamed to every human on every planet, a single message that shot across all 17 colonies at once. "We have been shown our place in this galaxy," he said, his expression grim. "We've been told that we're weak, that we're young, and that our lives don't matter. We've been ordered to accept the murder of our children and just get over it. We've been told there's nothing we can do." He took a breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was as cold as steel. "They are wrong." He then unveiled the creation of Project Phoenix. It was the single biggest undertaking in the entire history of mankind. Every human world was to contribute. Every single person had a job to do. The mission was easy to say, but nearly impossible to pull off. In 30 years, humanity would transform itself into a force so powerful that the galaxy could never, ever ignore it again. "We will not forget our dead," Martinez promised, his voice echoing with resolve. "We will carry their memory like a shield and a sword. That memory will be our fuel. Their sacrifice will be our sacred fire. And one day, when we are ready, we will demand the justice they denied us, not as beggars, but as equals." The reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. On every human world, people swamped recruitment centers for any available job. Scientists started working double, even triple shifts. Factory workers completely retooled their assembly lines in a single night. Teachers tossed out the old textbooks and wrote new ones from scratch. And parents told their children the story of New Cascadia, not as a fairy tale, but as a solemn promise, making absolutely certain that the flame of righteous anger would never be extinguished. The change seeped into every single part of human life. The entire civilian economy was redirected toward military production. Luxuries and consumer goods disappeared as every last ounce of resources was poured into weapons research and building starships. People accepted strict rationing without a single complaint. If you asked anyone why they were willing to give up so much comfort, the answer was always the same. For New Cascadia, for the 18 million. The whole education system was completely revolutionized. Every school now taught the raw, brutal truth of what happened. Every child learned the names of the dead. Not all 18 million, of course, but enough to make the loss feel real and personal. Sophia Santos, age 7. Michael Chen, age 12. Emma Okafor, age 5. The names were repeated like a prayer, a sacred vow that connected one generation to the next. Military academies swelled to 10 times their previous size. Young men and women who were raised on the stories of New Cascadia's fall signed up in waves. They weren't looking for personal vengeance. They wanted justice for their parents and grandparents, for the empty chairs that would always be at their family tables, for the faded photos of aunts, uncles, and cousins they would never know. A man named James Chen, the very same captain who had walked through the smoking ruins of Haven City and lost his brother's entire family, shot up through the ranks. He wasn't promoted for his grief. He was promoted because he was a strategic mastermind. He saw space combat in a way the old tradition-bound aliens never could. He thought differently. He planned differently, and he fought differently. The Vithkai expect us to line up our ships and fight them honorably, head on, he explained to his cadets at the academy. They expect formal battles, glorious duels, and strategies that are 1,000 years out of date. We are not going to give them what they expect. We are going to give them nightmares. He pioneered entirely new combat strategies, lightning speed over raw power, flawless network coordination over individual heroics, and constant, fluid adaptation over predictable tradition. Every single human ship would be a thinking part of a bigger, interconnected whole. The enemy wouldn't be fighting a fleet of ships. They'd be fighting a single, super-intelligent predator that was everywhere at once. And while the military was relearning how to fight, the scientists were working even harder. Human tech had been decades, maybe even centuries, behind the major galactic powers. That gap had to be closed, and then they had to jump generations ahead. Dr. Sarah Kim was put in charge of advanced weapons research. She was a brilliant physicist whose own daughter had been taken in the raid. Every morning, she would look at a picture of a smiling little girl with eyes that shone with happiness. Then she would go to work, designing weapons that could crack planets in two. "We won't be the ones to start this war," she told her team. "But when it starts, we're going to finish it so completely that no one will ever dream of attacking us again." Her team made one incredible breakthrough after another. They developed faster engines, stronger shields, and weapons that could rip through defenses the older races thought were invincible. And every single invention was classified, kept completely hidden from the rest of the galaxy. Humanity's merchant ships kept using their old, clunky technology. Human colonies kept their defenses looking weak and outdated. Everything new, everything lethal was kept out of sight. The shipyards were the beating heart of this silent revolution. Tucked away in forgotten asteroid belts and the swirling storms of gas giants, enormous construction facilities were built in absolute secrecy. The elder races had their spy networks and their listening stations, but humanity had perfected the art of hiding in plain sight. New ships were put together deep inside hollowed-out asteroids, in spaces that showed up as nothing more than dead rock on every scanner in the galaxy. Admiral Chen, the title James now held, watched as the very first of the new warships slid from its hidden dock. The ship was both beautiful and terrifying. A sleek black vessel covered in weapons, powered by engines that could outrun anything the Vethkai could even imagine. He had named the new class of ship the Vengeance. "How many," he asked quietly, "can we build?" "As many as we need," the shipyard commander answered without a second's thought. "The entire human race is pouring everything it has into this. We can build as many as it takes." 10 years in, humanity had 1,000 cutting-edge warships hidden in the dark corners of space. By year 20, that number had skyrocketed to 5,000. The original plan was for 10,000, but production was ramping up faster than anyone's wildest dreams. It was clear they were going to smash their target well ahead of schedule. The Concord's intelligence agencies would occasionally pick up strange blips in human space, a spike in industrial materials, odd energy readings, cargo ships taking weird routes, but their reports always reached the same simple conclusion: humanity was probably just rebuilding its economy, trying to heal from the trauma of New Cascadia. They weren't a threat. They were still a young, fragile, and insignificant species. Now, this conclusion wasn't stupid. It was just fatally wrong. The analysts were comparing human activity to what they believed humans were capable of. They had no clue that humanity's capabilities had shifted on a tectonic level. They were catching glimpses of a monster in the dark and just shrugging it off as nothing. The Vethkai grew cockier during those quiet years. A decade after New Cascadia, they hit another human colony, a small outpost named Far Haven. It was a smaller raid this time, only 200,000 people taken, but it was just as savage. Humanity did nothing. The Concord representative from Earth just expressed profound concern and grave disappointment. Human freighters continued their trade routes like nothing had happened. Human colonies stayed silent. It was as if the attack was nothing more than a bad dream. The Vuthkai found it hilarious. They'd been a little nervous after New Cascadia, worried humanity might do something stupid, but it was obvious now that humans were too shattered to even think about fighting back. They were the perfect victims, smart enough to be good slaves but too weak to ever resist. 20 years after New Cascadia, the Vuthkai hit them again. This time they raided a colony named Prosperity, snatching 500,000 humans. And again there was no reaction. Not one ship moved. It was like humanity simply took the hit and accepted its place. "They are utterly broken," Kethfor boasted before the conquered Presidium. "We have shown them who is in charge. They'll never fight back. They've learned their place." That's what the aliens thought. But behind the scenes, a storm was brewing. Every time they attacked, humanity took the recordings, the sounds of families being ripped apart, the chaos, the terror, and broadcast them to everyone old enough to understand. Each tragedy was just another log on the fire of pure, cold rage growing inside every human heart. After a raid on a colony called Prosperity, Admiral Chen stood before his top officers. His face was stone, but his eyes were burning. "How much longer?" he asked. His chief of staff replied, 10 more years, sir, and we'll be at 100%, but we could go right now if you gave the order." "We have 7,000 ships, and every crew is itching for a fight." "Not a single ship moves," Chen said, his voice flat and hard. "We wait. We get so strong that when we finally hit them, there won't be a single doubt about who wins. Our children have waited 20 years for justice. They can wait 10 more. Because when we go, we're only going once. We will throw everything we have at them and make sure this can never, ever happen again." He gazed out a window at the star-dusted darkness. Out there, millions of humans were enslaved in Vuthkai labor camps. Out there, the older, arrogant races were probably laughing at how weak humanity seemed. The galaxy thought it had humanity figured out. They were about to find out just how wrong they were as the 30th anniversary of the New Cascadia attack drew near. Humanity had changed so much you could barely recognize it. The peaceful, trusting species that was so easily ambushed was gone, replaced by something new, something patient, and something incredibly dangerous. Every child knew the names of the fallen. Every soldier spent their life training for the war they knew was coming. Every scientist worked on weapons that would turn the galactic power structure upside down. And every single human, from the oldest grandma to the youngest kid, carried a fire inside them. They called it the remembrance, but it was more than a memory. It was who they were now. It was the one thing that tied 20 billion humans on 17 different worlds together. They weren't just a people anymore. They were a promise. And a woman named Maria Santos was still alive. She was 82 years old now, living a quiet life in a tiny apartment back on Earth. For 30 years, she had never stopped looking for her little girl, Sophia. She never found a clue, but she never gave up hope. Every year, on the anniversary of the attack, she would light a single candle and say her daughter's name. "Sophia Santos," she'd whisper, her voice cracking with the grief that never faded. "Age 7, taken from New Cascadia, we have not forgotten you." At that exact same moment, Millions of others were doing the very same thing. 18 million candles flickering across 17 worlds. 18 million names whispered into the night. It was the most heartbreaking and the most terrifying ritual you could ever imagine. On the 29th anniversary, Admiral Chen Wei gave a speech. He was an old man now, his hair white, his face etched with lines of patience and hard work, but his voice was strong as steel. "Tomorrow we light the candles one last time," he said to the cameras. "Tomorrow we say the names one last time, and tomorrow we keep preparing. But I want you to know the wait is almost over. The day is coming when we stop mourning and we start fighting. The day the galaxy learns what it truly means to cross us." He paused, his eyes drilling into the lens. "And to the Vithkai listening in, and I know you are, I have a message for you too. Enjoy your stolen lives. Enjoy your power, because your time is running out. You taught us that strength is the only thing this galaxy respects. Well, we've been very good students, and class is about to be in session." The speech went out across all of human space and was immediately picked up by Vethkai spies. It made its way to Commander Vithrak, an old, scarred warrior who had actually led the attack on New Cascadia. He read the translation and just laughed. "They've been making empty threats for 30 years, he sneered. "Big words from a broken people. If they had any real power, they would have used it by now. It's just a bluff." A year later, as the sky above his home planet turned black with the shadows of human warships, he would remember saying that. He'd remember it as his entire world burned. But that was still a year away. For now, the galaxy carried on as usual. The ancient elder races played their political games. The Vethkai kept picking on weaker species, and humanity just kept waiting, quietly marking time until the remembrance finally became the reckoning. Deep in hidden shipyards, the last of the Vengeance-class battleships was getting its final checks. It was the 9,000th ship of the fleet and was set to become Admiral Chen's flagship. He had visited it while it was being built, walking its quiet halls and imagining the crew that would soon bring it to life. On the bridge, he found a small plaque the workers had put up. It listed the names of his own family members who died on New Cascadia, his brother, his sister-in-law, and their 3 small children. Below their names were 2 simple words: "We remember." Admiral Chen traced his fingers over the engraving. His eyes welled up, but his voice was steady. "Soon," he whispered to the empty room. "It's almost time." And deep in the blackness of space, 9,000 warships waited for his command. The 31st anniversary of the New Cascadia massacre started just like all the others. On 17 worlds, humans woke before the sun. They put on simple clothes and gathered with family. At exactly 9:47 a.m., the moment the first shots were fired, they lit their candles and spoke the names of the lost. But this year was different. As millions of candles flickered, Admiral Chen stood on the bridge of his flagship, the HS Remembrance. An entire fleet of 9,000 warships surrounded him, silent and invisible in the shadow of a dead star. Every ship was fully staffed, every weapon was fully charged, every engine hummed with restless energy. The Admiral looked at the single candle burning on his console. He had lit it himself, whispering the names of his brother's family. For 31 long years, that grief had been a heavy burden, and for 31 long years, he had been planning this moment. "Admiral," his officer said softly, "all ships are green. We're ready when you are." Chen nodded slowly. He looked at the flickering flame one last time, then reached out and pinched it out with his fingers. "The time for mourning is over," he said into the silence. "Now it's time for justice." He turned to his crew. They were so young, born after the attack, but they grew up on the stories. They knew the names. The same fire burned in their hearts just as hot as it did in the survivors. "Open a channel to the entire fleet," the admiral commanded. "Channel open, sir." Chen took a deep breath. His voice boomed across 9,000 ships, reaching hundreds of thousands of eager soldiers. "This is Admiral Chen. 31 years ago, they took our children, they took our families, and when we asked for justice, they laughed in our faces. Today, we give them our answer." He let his words hang in the air for a moment. "We are not fighting for land. We are not fighting for fame. We are fighting for the 18 million. We are fighting for the names we have spoken every single year for a generation. We fight so that no human will ever be taken from their home again." His voice turned to ice. "The galaxy called us weak, so we became strong. The galaxy called us young, so we became patient. The galaxy told us to know our place. Today, we're going to show them exactly where our place is." He raised his hand. "All ships, full power, jump to HFY space. The reckoning is here." In an instant, 9,000 ships dissolved into streaks of impossible light, ripping a hole in space as they leaped toward their destiny. For 30 years, humanity was the galaxy's punching bag, broken and enslaved. But for every one of those 30 years, they were also planning. So what happens when the hunted finally become the hunters? You're about to find out, and if you think you know where this is going, stick around, because I guarantee you're wrong. It all began in a deafening silence. There was no grand declaration of war, no final warning, just the quiet, methodical return of a species everyone had written off. The HFY Dominion, the very architects of humanity's pain, had no clue what was descending on their home system, Veth Prime. This was their crown jewel, their most ancient world, their most beautiful cities, and their most sacred ground, all guarded by 300 of their most powerful warships. And living there, in a sprawling mansion, was the monster at the heart of it all. Commander Thrak, the butcher of the New Cascadia massacre. Now old and retired, he was celebrated as a living legend, spending his final years surrounded by human slaves who catered to his every whim. He never wasted a single thought on the millions of souls he had extinguished. In his eyes, humans weren't people. They were tools, like breathing furniture. He was right in the middle of his morning meal when the first crack appeared in his perfect little universe. A servant, trembling with terror, dared to interrupt him. "Commander," the servant stammered, "there are vessels appearing in orbit, a very large number of them." Vithrak didn't even bother looking up from his food. "What kind of vessels? Who do they belong to?" The servant's voice was barely a whisper. "Their energy signatures are unknown, sir. We believe they might be human." For the first time, Commander Vithrak actually let out a small laugh. "Human ships? A dozen of them, perhaps 2 dozen, Tell the defense fleet to go swat those flies out of the sky. Do not disturb me with such nonsense." The servant's face went completely pale. "Sir, there are thousands." For the first time in 30 years, Vithrak felt the ice-cold touch of real fear. He scrambled to his command center and threw the orbital view up on the main screen. His dark eyes widened in sheer disbelief. The void around Veth Prime was literally being filled with warships. They were blinking into existence out of nowhere in silent waves, hundreds at a time, their dark gray hulls bristling with weapons that looked nothing like the primitive human tech he remembered. They moved in flawless formation, spreading out to envelop the entire planet like a tightening fist. "Impossible," Vithrak breathed. "This cannot be happening." The Vethkai Defense Fleet, 300 ships strong, surged out to meet them, completely assured of their technological dominance. After all, the Vethkai had been conquering star systems for 10,000 years. Humans? They'd barely been spacefaring for 2 centuries. This should have been a cakewalk. The entire battle was over in 4 hours. Except it wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The human ships moved with an impossible agility, and their weapons sliced through energy shields that were supposed to be unbreakable. Their tactics were fluid, adapting and countering every Vithkai maneuver before it was even completed. It was like trying to fight a swarm of phantoms with overwhelming firepower and a perfectly synchronized mind. From the command deck of his flagship, the Remembrance, Admiral Chen Wei watched it all unfold. He felt no surge of triumph, no thrill of victory. All he felt was a heavy, quiet satisfaction that a 30-year promise was finally being kept. "The enemy flagship has been neutralized," his tactical officer reported, her voice steady. "Their fleet is down to 47 vessels. The survivors are attempting to scatter," the officer continued. "Do not let a single one escape," Admiral Chen ordered, his voice as cold as deep space. "We need prisoners. We need to know the locations of the slave camps." The human fleet tightened its blockade. Most of the remaining Vethkai ships chose to fight to their destruction. In 10,000 years of conquest, they had never surrendered, and they weren't about to start now. But on a few ships, younger crews who had only heard stories of war decided they'd rather live. They powered down their weapons and sent out surrender signals. Human boarding teams swarmed them with terrifying speed and precision. They secured the prisoners, copied every piece of data from the ship's computers, and then, to the absolute astonishment of the Fifth Kai, they began treating the enemy's wounded. This was only the first of many shocks for the Vethkai prisoners. They were bracing for torture, for summary execution. Humans were prey, after all, and prey doesn't show mercy. "Why aren't you just killing us?" one of the Vethkai captains finally asked his guard. The guard, a young woman named Lieutenant Park, met his gaze with cold, unflinching eyes. "Because we are not you," she said simply. "We are here for justice, not for cruelty. The ones who gave the orders will answer for their crimes. The rest of you will be judged fairly." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "We are not monsters, but never, ever mistake our decency for weakness. Your people slaughtered 18 million of ours and worked another 4 million to death in your labor camps. We have a list," she said, her voice dropping to a deadly quiet. "A list of every commander, every officer, every single individual who orchestrated this or profited from our suffering. Every last one of you will be held accountable. The Vethkai captain saw something in her eyes far more terrifying than simple anger. He saw absolute certainty. She wasn't just hoping they would win. She knew it was already over. That unbreakable conviction was more chilling than any weapon. Down on the surface of Veth Prime, the ground invasion commenced. Human soldiers landed in precise, surgical deployments, hitting military command centers and government headquarters. They didn't carpet bomb the cities. They didn't harm a single civilian. They moved like surgeons, carefully excising the cancer of the Vethkai leadership. And Commander Vethrak, the great war hero, was now just a frightened old man, fleeing his own mansion as human ships blotted out his ski. He ran through streets choked with panicked citizens, desperately trying to reach a subterranean shelter. He was old, and his legs were failing him. For decades, his slaves had been the ones to carry him everywhere. A human troop carrier landed directly in his path, and soldiers poured out, weapons ready. Vethrak looked around in a panic, but he was completely boxed in. "Commander Vethrak," a voice called out. A human officer stepped away from the soldiers. She was a tall woman with streaks of gray in her hair and a face that seemed etched with decades of sorrow. "You are under arrest for crimes against humanity, specifically for orchestrating and executing the new Cascadia massacre, which led to the deaths of 18 million civilians and the enslavement of 4 million more." He stared at her, but her face was a blank to him, a nobody. She, however, remembered every last detail of his. "My name is Elena Vasquez," she said, her voice a low rumble holding back 30 years of fury. 31 years ago, I stood before the Galactic Concord and pleaded for justice for my people. You were present. You laughed." She closed the gap between them, her eyes boring into his. "Your delegate told me to take the scraps you were offering and be grateful. Do you remember what I promised you that day? I promised you would regret it. I promised you had a choice. You chose poorly, Commander." When Vethrak tried to form a response, no sound came out. For the very first time in his life, he truly understood what it felt like to be prey, to be completely and utterly helpless. "Get him off my world," Vasquez ordered. As the transport lifted off, Vethrak looked down upon the planet he had once ruled. Human warships now patrolled his skies. His gleaming cities were now under foreign occupation. His entire life's work was being systematically dismantled. It was in that moment that he finally understood the universe-shattering mistake he had made 31 years ago. Information from the captured Vethkai ships quickly revealed the locations of the slave camps. There were hundreds of them, scattered across their empire. For 3 decades, these facilities had been human processing centers, hells where millions were forced to labor until they died, bred like livestock, and then thrown away. Admiral Chen gave the order without hesitation, dispatching rescue fleets. Every second counted. The Vethkai could try to destroy the camps to erase the evidence of their atrocities. The first rescue ship reached a camp designated Theta 7 within hours. It was a brutal mining colony carved into a barren asteroid. Life sign detectors lit up. Thousands of humans were still alive inside. Commander Jackson, leading the assault force, gathered his soldiers. "All right, listen to me. We have no idea what state they're in down there. he said, his voice heavy. Some of these people have been held here for 30 years. They have survived an actual nightmare. So you will be gentle, you will be patient, and you will make absolutely certain every last one of them knows that they are finally going home. His team breached the outer doors and stormed in. What they discovered was far worse than anything they could have imagined. The tunnels were dark and filled with a toxic dust that clawed at their throats and made every breath a struggle. Then, out of the darkness, they emerged like specters from a nightmare. Human forms, little more than skeletons draped in rags, shuffled forward. The sound of their chains a ghostly percussion. Commander Jackson flipped his comms to external broadcast. This is the United Earth Federation. We're here to take you home. You're safe now. For a long, heart-stopping moment, only a stunned, disbelieving silence answered. Then, a voice, raspy and thin from a lifetime of silence, whispered from the shadows. Home. A frail figure stumbled into the harsh beam of his tactical light. It was a woman, so thin her skin was like paper stretched over a frame of bones. Her gray hair was a tangled mat, and her eyes were dull with a despair so deep it seemed endless. But as she looked at him, a tiny spark ignited in their depths. "Is this real? Are you really here?" she breathed. Her voice found a sliver of its former strength. "I'm Maria," she said. "Maria Santos. They took me from New Cascadia." "Is the war over?" she pleaded, her voice trembling. Did we win?" Commander Jackson reached up and broke the seal on his helmet, letting her see the tears streaming down his face. "Yes, Maria," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "We won. It's all over. We're taking you home." Maria Santos's legs buckled, and she crumpled to the ground, her body shaking with unrestrained sobs. All around her, others began to emerge from the darkness. Some were too frail to even stand. Others were carried by their fellow prisoners. All of them were weeping, calling out the names of loved ones they had lost, asking about a world they hadn't seen in 3 decades. The soldiers moved in gently, lifting them as medical teams rushed forward with blankets, water, and nutrient packs. For the first time in 30 years, the people of New Cascadia felt a human touch that was meant to heal, not to harm. At Camp Theta 7, they found fewer than 2,000 survivors. The camp's own meticulous records, however, listed over 50,000 human prisoners. The rest were buried in the mines. It was the same horrific story at every single camp they liberated across Vithkai territory. The rescue fleets kept finding survivors, but never enough. A few camps were marginally better than the others, but most were nothing more than death factories. When the final, horrifying tally was complete, just over 18,000 people had been found alive. 18,000 survivors from the 4 million who had been stolen from their homes. And as the unedited recordings from inside those camps were broadcast back to Earth, all of humanity finally understood the true soul-crushing cost of their victory. The broadcasts showed everything: the filth-caked living quarters, the sprawling mass graves, the cold, bureaucratic logs detailing every single death. They showed footage of children who had never known a day without chains, of old men and women worked to death, their bodies left where they fell. It was a gallery of cruelty so profound it seemed impossible. A firestorm of pure rage erupted across the human race, a fury hotter than any star. The Galactic Concord scrambled to call an emergency session, the ancient elder races utterly blindsided. They had never imagined humanity was capable of such a thing. They never dreamed anyone could so completely shatter the Vuthkai. The Presidium immediately sent a diplomatic envoy to Admiral Chen, offering to broker a peace treaty. Surely, they pleaded, enough blood had been spilled. Surely humanity had proven its point. It was time to talk. Admiral Chen welcomed the diplomats aboard his flagship. He was a gracious host, offering them refreshments and comfortable chairs. Then he made them watch the raw, unedited footage from the slave camps. The envoys sat in a cold, horrified silence. To their credit, a few of them looked genuinely sick. The others were unreadable. 30 years ago, Admiral Chen said after the screen went dark, his voice dangerously quiet, "We came to the Concord begging for help. You told us that the internal practices of member states were not your business. You said the Vuthkai had a right to manage their labor force as they saw fit." He leaned forward, his eyes like chips of granite. "You called our enslaved children a labor force. You offered us financial compensation for our dead. You laughed at us when we demanded justice." "The Concord admits that certain errors in judgment were made," one of the envoys finally stammered. "Errors?" Chen's voice was a whisper, but it cut through the room like a razor. 18 million dead, 4 million taken, 30 years of torture and murder. You call that an error? He stood and turned to the main viewport, staring out at the star-dusted blackness. "Your offer to mediate comes 30 years too late," he said. "We gave you the chance to do the right thing. You chose to look away. I suggest you look away again. This was never your fight. You made that perfectly clear a long time ago." "Admiral," another envoy began, choosing his words with great care, "the Concord possesses considerable military strength. If you press this campaign any further, we might be forced to get involved." Chen turned, his expression perfectly calm, which was the most terrifying thing about him. "Then, get involved," he said flatly. "We planned for that too. We've spent 30 years planning for every possibility. And I give you my word, if the Concord sides with slavers, if you choose to defend murderers, you will learn the exact same lesson the Vuthkai are learning right now." He gestured to the viewport, where the shattered remains of the Vuthkai fleet drifted like burning embers. "And the lesson is simple," he said. "Humanity pays its debts, humanity finishes what it starts, and humanity never ever forgets." The envoys left with nothing. Their report to the Concord Presidium was brief. Humanity was no longer listening to reason. They were going to have their justice, no matter the cost. The Presidium argued for days. Some screamed for immediate military intervention. Others urged caution. In the end, they chose to do nothing and wait, hoping humanity would be satisfied with the damage they'd already done. They hoped humanity would just stop. They didn't stop. The methodical dismantling of the Vuthkai Empire continued without pause. Human fleets moved from system to system, crushing all resistance, freeing every last slave, and arresting every war criminal they found. This was not a war of extermination. Humanity had no interest in wiping out the Vuthkai people. They were simply erasing their empire from the galactic map.
Every official who ever made a profit from slavery was put in chains. Every military officer who took part in the raids was taken prisoner. Every piece of data that recorded human suffering was collected, catalogued, and archived for the trials to come. And on 1,000 different worlds, the survivors of the camps were finally coming home. They were given the best medical care, the best trauma counseling, and all the time in the world to start healing. The scars would last forever, but they were finally free. Maria Santos was one of them. She returned to Earth and found cousins she thought were long dead. But when they asked her about her daughter, Sophia, she broke down completely. She died in the camps, Maria wept. She was only 12. They worked her until she just collapsed, and then she couldn't finish. But later that night, she stood by her window, looking up at the stars. Somewhere out there, in the deep dark, human ships were still fighting. Human soldiers were still kicking down doors. Human justice was still being served. "We did it, Sophia," Maria whispered into the quiet room. "We didn't forget you. We never forgot." And out in the silent expanse of space, the great reckoning went on. The Galactic Concord was paralyzed by a fear it had never known. For 10,000 years, the elder races had run the spiral arm unchallenged. They had fought wars, certainly, but those wars had rules, they had limits. So what happens when you poke a sleeping giant? The Vathkai Empire, the galaxy's biggest bully, was finding out the hard way. They had pushed humanity too far, and now it was time to pay the price. A mere 3 months after the Vathkai homeworld fell, humanity's retribution fleet had already conquered 2/3 of their territory. City after city surrendered without a fight. Fleet after fleet was annihilated. The most feared military in the sector was being systematically taken apart, while the ancient elder races could do nothing but watch in shock. Before the Galactic Presidium, the Vathkai ambassador, the last high-ranking official not in a human prison, pleaded for his people. "You have to make them stop," he begged, his voice breaking. "We are officially invoking the Mutual Defense Treaty. We need your help." The Primarch, a being as old as the stars who had led the Concord for 1,000 years, considered the request in silence. The treaty was clear. An unprovoked attack against one member required a response from all. But then the crystalline ambassador spoke, his voice like the chime of faint bells. "The treaty specifies an unprovoked attack," he pointed out. "The Vathkai attacked human colonies first. They slaughtered millions and enslaved millions more. One could easily argue this is merely humanity acting in self-defense." "Self-defense?" the Vathkai ambassador shrieked. "They are seizing our planets. They are broadcasting the trials of our leaders for the entire galaxy to see. They are destroying everything our empire ever built." "An empire built on a foundation of human bones," the Zathi ambassador replied, his voice echoing with a chilling calm. "Perhaps you should have thought about that before you decided to treat an entire species like cattle." For weeks, the argument raged through the great halls of the Presidium. Some of the older, more established races wanted to step in. The Vathkai were valuable allies, and their slave trade was incredibly profitable. But the real reason was simple fear. If humanity could rise up and do this to the Vathkai, who were supposed to be the galaxy's toughest predators, then who was truly safe? Today, it's them,
The ambassador from the Krell Empire thundered. If we let this outrage stand, tomorrow it could be us. We have to crush this threat before it gets any stronger. But many others weren't so sure. The videos leaked from the human slave camps had spread across the Galactic network, and public opinion was turning like a tide. Suddenly, the Vethkai didn't look like victims. They looked like monsters who were finally getting what they deserved. In the end, only 3 races voted to go to war: the Krell Empire, the Vorak Hegemony, and the Kath Confederation. They gathered a colossal armada of 12,000 warships, the largest fleet the Concord had seen in 1,000 years. This should be more than enough to handle the human problem, the Krell commander boasted with a smirk. The Vithkai just got soft and lazy. We won't make the same mistake. The combined fleet ripped open space-time, jumping directly into human-controlled territory, ready for the fight of their lives. What they found instead was a slaughterhouse. Admiral Cheney hadn't just been waiting for them. He had been counting on them coming. Those 30 silent years of human agony weren't just spent planning to fight back against the Vithkai. Human strategists had obsessed over every major power in the galaxy. They knew Krell battle formations better than the Krell did. They knew the fatal flaws in every Vorak tactic. They knew the schematics of every single piece of Kath technology. And they had engineered a specific counter for every last one. The Battle of the Red Nebula was over in 6 hours. When the smoke cleared, 8,000 of the 12,000 conquered ships were nothing but shattered, drifting tombs. The rest ran for their lives. Human ships had blinked into existence out of nowhere, using the swirling red gas of the nebula itself as a cloak. They shut down all communications, slicing the massive fleet into small, panicked groups, and then took them apart piece by piece. They unleashed weapons the conquered couldn't even comprehend, and they did it while losing less than 300 of their own ships. "How?" the Krell commander screamed as his own command bridge started to tear apart around him. "How is this possible? You were just primitives. You were nothing. How did you become this?" Admiral Cheney's voice, steady and clear, broadcast across all channels. "You gave us 30 years, he said. 30 years of suffering to fuel our anger. 30 years of looking down on us to sharpen our minds. You gave us 30 years to plan for this very day, and you ask how we became this?" He paused for a heartbeat. "You made us this way. Don't forget it." A moment later, a single missile slipped through the Krell commander's defenses and his flagship vanished in a silent flash of light. News of the massacre at the Red Nebula spread like a shockwave. The elder races, who had always viewed themselves as the shepherds of the galaxy, were struck by a chilling realization. They weren't at the top of the food chain anymore. Some frantically tried to forge new alliances, desperate to stop the humans, but their arrogance had been shattered. Nobody wanted to be the next to face that fleet. Nobody wanted to find out what humanity's idea of justice really looked like. Others tried a different strategy, sending diplomats rushing to Admiral Cheney with offers of peace, lucrative trade deals, anything to get on humanity's good side. Cheney met with all of them, listened to their proposals, and then calmly turned down every single one. "We are not at war with the Concord," he told them. "Our fight is with the Vithkai. Stay out of our way and you will be safe. Let us finish this, and we will have no argument with any of you. But if you stand up to defend slavers, if you shield the monsters who butchered our children for profit, then you will make yourselves our enemy, and we will deal with you as such." The conquered got the message loud and clear. They put out a few pathetic statements condemning humanity's unprovoked aggression, but they kept their fleets parked in their home systems. From a very safe distance, they watched as humanity methodically took apart the entire Vithkai Empire. It took 2 years. In that time, humanity liberated every single slave camp, put thousands of war criminals in chains, and seized control of every planet the Vithkai had ever called their own. It was the most overwhelming military victory the galaxy had ever seen. But to everyone's shock, humanity didn't wipe them out. The human forces moved with the precision of surgeons. They obliterated military installations. They seized government centers. They confiscated every last weapon. But they left the civilian population virtually untouched. "We are not murderers," Admiral Cheney said in a press conference. "We do not punish the children for the sins of the father. The Vithkai people will live on, but the Vithkai Empire is gone for good." The trials started on the first anniversary of the liberation. Commander Vithrak and over 3,000 of his officials were brought before a human court to answer for their crimes. The entire trial was broadcast across the galaxy. Every species watched as the horrifying truth was laid bare. Combat logs of the initial unprovoked slaughter, soul-crushing testimony from the survivors, official Vithkai records detailing their plans for the slave raids, and medical reports that described the hellish conditions in the labor camps. Commander Vithrak could only sit there, forced to watch the legacy of his own cruelty be exposed to the universe. He tried to defend himself, claiming it was simply the way of his people. "Slavery is the natural way of things," he argued arrogantly. "The strong have a right to rule the weak. It has always been so." The chief prosecutor, a human woman named Dr. Sarah Kim, answered with a voice as cold as deep space. "The defendant claims he was simply following his tradition," she said to the court. "So let's remind everyone what that Vithkai tradition actually is." A massive hologram filled the courtroom, showing images from the camps. Workers so starved they looked like skeletons, mass graves overflowing with bodies, and images of children born into slavery who were worked to death before they had a chance to live. "This is your tradition," she said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "And this is the destiny of any civilization that builds its greatness on the backs of others." The trials went on for months. In the end, Commander Vithrak and 2,000 other high-ranking officials were found guilty of crimes against all sentient life. The sentences were varied. Some got long prison sentences, others were exiled to desolate worlds, but Vithrak himself received the most fitting punishment of all. He wasn't given a quick death. Humanity had evolved past that. Instead, he was sentenced to live out the rest of his very long life in a special containment cell. Every single day, from the second he woke up to the second he fell asleep, he would be forced to listen to the recorded testimonies of the millions of people whose lives he had destroyed. "You wanted humans to serve your every need," Dr. Kim told him as the final sentence was read. "Now, you will spend the rest of your existence serving their memory. And maybe, just maybe, by the time your life is over, you will finally understand a fraction of the pain you caused." Vithrak was dragged away, screaming that it was all a lie, that humanity had no right, that the galaxy would never allow it. But no one came to save him. The galaxy had seen the truth. The galaxy had heard the testimony. And the galaxy quietly agreed that the Vithkai had gotten exactly what they had coming. The rest of the Vithkai people were moved to new reservation worlds. They were beautiful planets filled with resources for a good life, but they were completely demilitarized and their spacefaring technology was taken away. The Vithkai as a species would survive, but they would never threaten anyone ever again. "You are being given a second chance," Admiral Cheney told the new Vithkai leaders. "Use it to build something worthy. In 5 generations, if you can show us that you've learned to live in peace, we might reconsider your status. But if you ever go back to your old ways, if you ever hurt another living soul, we will return, and next time, we won't be so merciful." The Vithkai leaders were powerless to argue. They could only nod and accept their fate. With the Vithkai Empire broken and the so-called Galactic conquered, completely humiliated, Admiral Cheney stood on the bridge of his flagship to address the galaxy one last time. It was time to set the new rules. His message was broadcast to every corner of the spiral arm. On 1,000 different worlds, 1,000,000 different species watched the human admiral. 31 years ago, he began, his voice calm but heavy. "The Vithkai burned our colony of New Cascadia to ash. They murdered 18 million of our people and put another 4 million in chains. We came to you, the Galactic conquered, and begged for justice. And you know what you did? You laughed. You offered us money for our dead children and told us to move on. You called us weak. You called us young. You called us insignificant." He paused, letting that hard truth sink in, a silence that was felt across thousands of light years. "We proved them wrong. The Vithkai Empire is now a history lesson. Their war machine is scrap metal. Their leaders have answered for their crimes. As a threat to this galaxy, they are finished. We did that. We, the people they wrote off as insignificant." His voice became as hard as steel. "Let me be crystal clear to every being listening right now. We do not want war. We have no desire to rule anyone. But we will defend our people. We will protect our homes, and we will never again allow another New Cascadia to happen. Not ever." He leaned closer to the camera, his eyes practically glowing. "To any species out there that still thinks humanity is an easy target, I suggest you look at the Vithkai. They were bigger than us. They had more ships, better tech, and a history of conquest a mile long. Today, they live on reservations, stripped of every shred of their former power. That is the price for threatening us. And for anyone who thinks they can push us around, I want you to remember the Red Nebula. 3 of the Conquered's own elder races sent 12,000 warships to teach us a lesson. 6 hours later, we had turned 8,000 of them into memorials for their own arrogance. That is what happens when you get in our way. We are not asking to join your little club anymore. We don't need your validation, and we certainly don't need your friendship. We're just laying out the new reality," he said, his hand rising to point straight at 1,000,000,000,000 stunned viewers across the stars. "This galaxy taught us that strength is the only language it understands. Well, we learned. From now on, anyone who hurts our people, threatens our homes, or stands in the way of our future will face the complete, focused wrath of humanity. This isn't a threat. It's not up for discussion. It's a fact."
He lowered his hand, a hint of something other than cold fury in his eyes. But we are not monsters. We proved that by not erasing the Vathkai from the cosmos. We proved it by giving their butchers fair trials, something they never gave our kids. We showed mercy to a people who never showed us any. Humanity wants peace. We want to build, to trade, to explore. We want to be a part of this galactic community, but we will do it as equals, never again as someone's victim. He stood taller, the starlight catching the silver in his hair. Remember what we did. Remember that we waited 30 years for this moment of justice. Remember that we never backed down, never gave up, and never forgot what they took from us. And above all, remember this: we will wait again if we must. We will rebuild our power if we have to. And if anyone is ever foolish enough to challenge us again, we will win again. That is our message to the galaxy. We remember, we endure, and we do not forgive those who harm our children. And just like that, the broadcast cut to black. Across the galaxy, trillions were frozen in a stunned silence, the Admiral's final words hanging in the air. The old universe, with its old rules, was dead. A new era had just been born, and humanity was standing at its very center. They were no longer the scrappy young race you could just push around. Back on Earth, crowds that had filled city squares and parks to watch the address absolutely erupted. There were cheers, there were tears, and strangers were hugging each other. For the first time in 31 long years, they actually felt safe. The quiet rage that had been passed down for a generation finally had real power behind it. And the 18 million souls lost so long ago could finally rest, knowing their children and grandchildren would never suffer the same fate. The war was over, but humanity's real journey was just starting. 5 years passed in the blink of an eye. The galaxy was a completely different place. The old empires were rattled, and the old ways of doing things were shattered. And at the heart of it all was the species that everyone used to underestimate. To the absolute shock of the galactic community, humanity didn't go on a rampage. Everyone expected them to use their victory to start a campaign of conquest. After all, that was how the game was played. You beat one enemy, then you steamroll the next and the next until you own a piece of the galaxy. But humans didn't play by those rules. Instead, they formed something new, something called the Human Protectorate. It wasn't an empire, it was a promise. A mutual defense agreement. The deal was simple. Human worlds would protect each other. Their fleets would patrol their own territory. Their soldiers would be ready to defend their homes, but they never went looking for a fight. They didn't snatch up new planets or bully other species into submission. We only fight when we have no other choice, Admiral Cheney explained to a crowd of fascinated reporters. We built this power for our own safety, not to rule over anyone else. The galaxy has enough empires. It really doesn't need another one from us. The ancient races in the galactic concord could only watch, completely baffled and maybe just a little bit scared. No one in the galaxy could make sense of it. They saw a species with the power of gods that simply chose not to use it for expansion. In all of recorded history, overwhelming power had always been used for one thing: conquest. So very carefully, a few of the braver species began to reach out. The first was the Ziththi Collective, a race of crystalline beings who cherished art and knowledge more than anything. They were one of the few who had argued against trying to block humanity's quest for justice. Their ambassador had even publicly defended humanity's right to settle the score on their own terms. We would be deeply honored to open diplomatic relations, the Zathi ambassador offered to humanity's new president, a sharp and brilliant woman named Victoria Okonkwo. We believe our two peoples have much to learn from one another. President Okonkwo warmly accepted. Soon, new trade routes were buzzing with activity and cultural exchanges were in full swing. Zathi scholars wandered wide-eyed through human universities, while our scientists got to tour their incredible deep space observatories. Once the Zathi broke the ice, other species started to come around. Some were genuinely curious. Others were just afraid, figuring it was much smarter to be humanity's friend than its potential enemy. Whatever their motives, the lonely isolation that had surrounded humanity for decades was finally over. But humanity hadn't forgotten the tough lessons it had learned. They remembered who had simply stood by and watched them suffer, and they absolutely remembered who had sent fleets to help the monstrous Vithkai. For empires like the Krell, the Vorak, and the Selith, the path to forgiveness was going to be very, very long. Their ambassadors were met with a polite but chillingly formal reception. Trade with their sectors was slowed to a mere trickle. Any discussion of military cooperation was immediately shut down. "You chose your side at the Red Nebula," President Okonkwo told the Krell ambassador, her voice as cold as the void between stars. "You sent your navy to shield slavers and murderers. You tried to stop us from saving our own people. We have not forgotten that." "But that war is long over," the ambassador stammered. "Surely we can move past this." "We will move on when we decide we're ready," Okonkwo replied, her gaze fixed on him. "Perhaps in another generation, perhaps in 100 years. Humanity has a very long memory, Ambassador. I thought you would have learned that by now." He left with absolutely nothing, just like every other representative from the powers that had tried to stand in their way. The old Galactic Concord was still around, but it was just a shadow of what it once was. When humanity flatly refused to join, it sent a clear signal to the rest of the galaxy. The old guard was now irrelevant. One by one, other systems began making their own treaties and alliances, ignoring the conquered entirely. The Zathi and humans grew even closer. The Selith, deeply ashamed of their part in the failed intervention, withdrew from galactic politics almost completely. On the anniversary of the Battle of the Red Nebula, the Primarch, the ancient stone-like being who had led the Concord for 3,000 years, finally addressed the assembly. "We made a catastrophic error," he admitted, his voice thick with the weight of millennia of pride. "When humanity came to us, broken and bleeding, we sent them away. We told them that they didn't matter. We told them their murdered children were not our concern." The leader's voice echoed through the massive chamber, a confession delivered to the most powerful beings in the galaxy. "We were wrong. We created the very force that brought us to our knees. Every time we dismissed a human plea for help, we were just adding fuel to their fire. Every year we allowed the Vethkai savages to raid their colonies. We were hardening their will into something unbreakable. We thought we were teaching them their place in the universe, but all we really taught them was how to be strong." He paused, letting the truth of his words settle in. "Let this be a lesson to every one of us. The weak don't always stay weak. The young eventually grow up, and the ones we trample under our feet today may very well become our judges tomorrow. We would all be wise to remember that.
For the Galactic conquered, that was the closest thing to an apology anyone was ever going to get. Far away, on a world named New Cascadia, the last of the rebuilding was finally finished. The planet, which had once been a massive grave, was now thriving with life. Gleaming cities rose from the old ruins, and new forests stretched across the once scorched land. A new generation of children played in parks built on the very ground where their grandparents had made a final, desperate stand. In the center of Haven City stood the Memorial Plaza. 18 million stone markers stood in silent, perfect lines, each one carved with a name. People traveled from every human world to walk among them, to run their fingers over the names and to make sure they never forgot. Maria Santos made the trip every single year.
She was 92 years old now, and while her body was fragile, her spirit was made of iron. She walked the long rows until she found the one she always looked for. Sofia Santos, age 7, taken from New Cascadia, died in captivity, never forgotten. Maria knelt, her old bones protesting, and placed a small bundle of flowers at the foot of the marker. "I made it back home, Sofia," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I survived, and I'm home now. I wish so badly I could have brought you with me. I wish I could have saved you. All I could do was remember." She gently touched the cool stone. "They came for us, my love. They came with fleets and armies, and all the power we used to pray for in those terrible years. They smashed the Vethkai to pieces. They punished every last one of the monsters who hurt us," she continued, tears tracing lines down her wrinkled cheeks. "They freed every single one of us. You didn't die for nothing, Sofia. None of you did. Your suffering became our strength. Your memory became our promise. And now, because of what you all endured, no human child will ever have to go through that again." She pushed herself to her feet, waving away a kind young park attendant who had rushed over to help. "I'll see you again soon, my sweet girl. Not today, but soon. You just wait for me." She walked away, a small figure moving through a sea of stone as the sunset painted the sky in brilliant shades of gold and red. On the 40th anniversary of the massacre, Ambassador Elena Vasquez, then aged 93, gave one final interview. Imagine being told your family was murdered and then being offered cash to just get over it. That's the offer the galaxy gave humanity after 18 million of our people, including thousands of children, were burned alive on New Cascadia. The Galactic Council, in all their wisdom, told us to take the money, bury our dead, and be grateful for the scraps they threw us. They actually sneered while they said it. They thought our grief had a price tag. They had no idea who they were dealing with. If you think that's messed up, hit that subscribe button, because you won't believe what humanity did next. You see, we humans are a bit different. We love with everything we have. We grieve with our entire souls. And when our children are stolen from us, we don't rest until justice is served. An admiral named James Chen knew this better than anyone. He walked through the smoking ruins of his brother's home on New Cascadia. He lost his brother, his sister-in-law, and his 3 little nieces that day. Standing in the ashes of his entire family, he made a quiet promise not to them, but to the universe itself. This would never, ever happen again. For years, the galaxy watched as humanity cashed their checks. We went quiet.
The other races called us a broken species, a sad little footnote in galactic history. They thought we had taken the payout and accepted our place at the bottom of the food chain. That was our first little surprise for them, because while we were publicly grieving, we were privately preparing. Every dollar they gave us, every piece of tech they sold us as a pity gift, became another nail in our enemy's coffin. We were turning our sorrow into steel. Then, after a decade of silence, came the big reveal. The galaxy had all but forgotten about the tragedy at New Cascadia. But one morning, the Vithke, the monsters who had attacked us, woke up to find their sky blotted out. It wasn't a solar eclipse. It was the United Earth Vengeance Fleet, a ghost fleet no one knew existed, built in secret, funded by the galaxy's own guilt money, tens of thousands of warships appearing from nowhere, a promise made in ash about to be kept in fire. But Admiral Chen wasn't just a warrior out for blood. He was a symbol of what we can achieve when we stand as one. He didn't just want to punish the Vithkai. He wanted to send a message to the entire galaxy. He wanted them to know that we would not surrender, we would not give up, and we would turn our deepest pain into our greatest strength. His fleet didn't just fight. It systematically dismantled the Vithkai Empire, freeing every species they had enslaved and bringing their leaders to justice. He turned us from victims into victors, from the galaxy's prey into a power the galaxy had to respect. Imagine a world where your entire life is wiped out and the rest of the universe just looks away. For one silent minute, 25 billion people held their breath, a shared heartbeat of remembering. Then, just as suddenly, life went on. It's been a decade since the Great Reckoning, and now humanity holds a real seat at the galactic table, not as a junior member, but as a full partner. Our scientists are now making discoveries with the best minds of the Zithi. Our artists are galactic stars, their creations celebrated on hundreds of worlds. Our traders negotiate for goods prized across the cosmos, but we never, ever forget. We now call it the Protector Fleet. The name is softer, but the steel is just as hard, and the will behind it is just as unbreakable as when it was called Vengeance. Every single one of us knows that peace is only kept through strength, and we have vowed to never be weak again. The yearly memorial on New Cascadia is now one of the most significant events on the galactic calendar. Beings from every corner of the spiral arm send representatives to witness the somber ceremony. Some attend out of sincere respect, others from a morbid curiosity, and a few come to remind themselves what happens when you push a quiet species too far. For the 50th anniversary, a new monument was dedicated. It's a breathtaking sculpture of a human woman holding a small child, her face turned toward the heavens in absolute defiance. And carved at its base are 5 simple words: "We protect the future. Never again." Thousands of humans stood beside representatives from dozens of alien races as the event was broadcast to the entire galaxy. The current president, a man named James Santos, who is Maria's own great-nephew, delivered the speech. 50 years ago, he began, they set our world on fire. 50 years ago, we were utterly alone in a galaxy that couldn't care less if we lived or died. 50 years ago, we were faced with a choice. He gestured to the towering monument. It wasn't simple. We could have agreed to their terms, We could have buried our dead and our sorrow and just tried to move on. We could have stayed the quiet, insignificant species they always believed us to be. His voice started to rise with emotion, but we didn't. We chose to remember. We chose to prepare. We chose to fight, and we chose to win.
Some wonder if we paid too high a price, the speaker's voice echoed. Those silent years were tough. The reckoning was brutal. And the transformation we all experienced, we're still figuring out who we've become. But I ask you, what is the cost of freedom? How much is safety worth? What is the going rate for knowing your children will never be dragged away in chains? That they will never have to burn while the rest of the galaxy just changes the channel? That they will never scream for a help that isn't coming? He pointed to the endless fields of memorial markers. The 18 million who died here paid that price. The 4 million who wasted away in the camps paid that price. Every human who bled and sacrificed during those silent years paid that price. And because of them, we are standing here, free. He then turned, his gaze fixed on the alien delegations. To our friends among the stars, thank you for being with us today, even if you weren't with us back then. We appreciate your friendship. We look forward to collaborating with you toward a future where every species is treated with dignity. But, he said, his voice turning to cold steel, to anyone else out there listening who might be considering making the same mistake as those who came before, we have a message for you. Remember New Cascadia. Remember the silent years, and remember the reckoning that came after. Remember what happens to those who hunt the innocent. He lifted his hand to the sky where the first stars were beginning to appear in the twilight. We are human. We remember. We endure, and we will never, ever forget. The crowd erupted in a roar that seemed to shake the very ground. The alien representatives watched, their expressions a mix of awe, fear, and a new, profound understanding. Far above, the ships of the Protector fleet sailed by in a silent, mighty parade, their navigation lights like slow-moving stars. On the bridge of one of those warships, a young officer named Sophia Chen observed the ceremony on a screen below. She was named after Admiral Chen's niece, a little girl who was lost on New Cascadia. She represented the 4th generation of her family to serve in this fleet, a legacy of purpose forged from unimaginable grief. She reached out and lightly touched the cool viewport, her eyes fixed on the lights of the Memorial Plaza, sparkling like a new constellation on the planet's surface. "We remember," she whispered, the very same words her great-grandfather had choked out while standing in the smoldering ruins of his entire world. "We remember, and we endure." The warship maintained its course, rejoining the endless patrol that ensures humanity's safety. Down on New Cascadia, the ceremony was concluding, and people began to head home. Some lingered, tracing the names carved into the memorial markers with their fingertips. Others simply gazed up at the stars, reflecting on how vast the galaxy was, and how humanity had carved out its own place within it. The fire that was ignited 50 years ago was still burning inside every single one of them. But it was no longer just a fire of grief and rage. It was a fire of fierce determination, of unbreakable unity, of a promise that could never be broken. Have you ever felt completely helpless? Like the universe just decided to bully you and there was nothing you could do? That's exactly how we felt on New Cascadia. One minute, our biggest worry was whether the crops would get enough sun. The next, a shadow fell over our entire planet. An alien empire called the Lumen, with ships that blocked out the stars, delivered a message that chilled us to the bone. They were here to harvest our children. They called it an honor, an ascension. We called it kidnapping. They gave us 1 hour to comply, or they'd wipe us from existence. We were farmers and teachers, not soldiers. We were the ultimate underdogs facing an impossible injustice. And I was just a first-grade teacher, holding my son Leo's hand, watching that countdown timer tick away in the town square. What would you do? Before you answer, subscribe and listen to what we did. My name is Alara, and Leo, my son, loved to collect shiny rocks. He had a little wooden box filled with them, each one a memory of a day spent exploring the fields. That box was the most precious thing in the world to me, because it represented his innocence, his future, and the Lumen wanted to steal it. Our first surprise came when our planetary defense cannons fired, and their shields just giggled, shimmering like a heat haze. They didn't even fire back. They were so powerful, they were bored. Desperate, I remembered an old piece of junk in the school's basement, an ancient deep space comms unit from the pioneers. On a whim, I powered it up and screamed an SOS into the void. To my shock, someone answered, but it wasn't a fleet. It was just one guy, a grizzled old junk hauler named Jax, whose ship was barely holding itself together. He told us he couldn't fight them, that nobody could. But he gave us our next surprise. The Lumen's greatest weapon wasn't their ships, it was fear. Their mothership broadcast a psychic field that made everyone just give up. And that's when he told us the horrible truth, the big reveal that changed everything. The Lumen weren't taking our children to be ascended. They were psychic vampires, feeding on the pure, unfiltered hope of the young to keep themselves immortal. Our children were nothing but a power source. And that's when my teacher brain switched into a me brain. What's the opposite of the soul-crushing fear they were broadcasting? The answer hit me like a lightning bolt. The fierce, unstoppable, terrifying love of a parent protecting their child. We had no weapons, but we had that. Using the colony's communication network, I rigged a feedback loop. Every parent on the planet focused on one single thought: you will not touch my child. As Jax flew his rust bucket ship on a suicide run to get a signal booster near their mothership, we unleashed it. We didn't scream with our voices, we screamed with our soul. That wave of pure, concentrated protective love hit their fleet. And for beings who had only ever consumed gentle hope, it was poison. It shattered their psychic consciousness. Their ships went dark, one by one, adrift and silent in our sky. We had won. We put them to the test against the very worst the galaxy had to offer, and we didn't just survive. We prevailed. As long as that fire burns in our hearts, as long as we remember the lesson of New Cascadia, no one will ever dare to threaten our children again. The galaxy learned a hard lesson that day, and humanity will make damn sure it's never forgotten. Back on the plaza, a monument now stands in the darkness, lit by soft lights that will burn forever. The stone figure of a mother locks her gaze on the stars, a silent promise of sorrow, hope, and a love so powerful it can shatter worlds. At her feet an inscription glows in the night: we protect the future, never again. And all across the galaxy, wherever humans live and dream, those words now echo in their very souls. Never again, never again, never again.